Imagine Budapest in the middle of 1944. It was the last major city in Europe where a large community still remained under the threat of systematic destruction. And it was into the very center of that tragedy that a 32-year-old businessman from one of Sweden's wealthiest families voluntarily stepped. His name was Raoul Wallenberg. He had no professional diplomatic experience and no background in intelligence work. He left behind a quiet life in a neutral country and walked straight into absolute chaos. What kind of inner strength does it take to make a choice like that, knowing there may be no way back? According to early reports from the Swedish mission, before his arrival in July 1944, officials had issued only a few hundred temporary passports to people in need. The bureaucracy moved slowly, afraid of provoking the anger of the occupying authorities. Wallenberg broke that system within days. Based on post-war estimates by international commissions, this one man directly pulled between 7,000 and 9,000 people from the jaws of death and indirectly helped tens of thousands more. That raises an obvious question. How could one man, armed only with paper, stamps, and astonishing nerve, outmaneuver a well-oiled war machine? The story of Raoul Wallenberg is not just a rescue story. It is an extraordinary espionage thriller in which the stakes were human lives. But how did a young architect with no military background end up on a secret American shortlist for a rescue mission on the very day the chief overseer of the death camps arrived at Budapest station? To understand the scale of Wallenberg's task, you first have to grasp the catastrophe unfolding in the spring of 1944. Germany's allies were losing ground on every front, and in Berlin, suspicion was growing that the Hungarian government was trying to find a secret way out of the war. The response was immediate. According to declassified Wehrmacht directives, the occupation of Hungary began on March 19, 1944. The streets of the capital filled with armored vehicles, and the official authorities were paralyzed by fear. But the worst danger was hidden behind the army units. Following the troops into Budapest came a special detachment under Adolf Eichmann, the ruthless technocrat responsible for the logistics of mass extermination across Europe. His plan was chillingly efficient. He began with the provinces, making sure people would have no chance to hide in the big city. Surviving transport records preserve horrifying numbers. In just 56 days, more than 430,000 people were deported from the Hungarian countryside to places of mass confinement. How could anyone resist a system operating with that kind of conveyor belt precision? Local officials preferred to look away, while diplomats from neutral countries sent cautious notes of protest that disappeared straight into archive folders. The machine kept running without a single interruption and was preparing to move on the population of the capital itself until an urgent coded message landed on the president's desk in Washington, demanding immediate and unconventional action. Across the ocean, it was becoming clear that traditional diplomacy had run its course. The United States government created a special war refugee board whose mission was to act quickly, quietly, and outside the usual bureaucratic channels. They needed someone carrying the passport of a neutral country, someone who could go straight into the enemy's jaws. Declassified memoirs and intelligence reports describe in detail a meeting that took place in Stockholm in June 1944. Ivar Olsson, a representative of the U.S. Treasury, invited Raoul Wallenberg to dinner. At first, the choice seemed almost paradoxical. Why him? Raoul had traveled extensively across Europe, spoke several languages brilliantly, had an architectural education, and most importantly, understood human psychology from years of business dealings. Olsson saw in him the ideal agent, intelligent, charming, and completely fearless. According to the financial records of the War Refugee Board, $100,000 were allocated for the first phase of this risky operation, an enormous sum for that time. But did that financial gamble really justify sending an untrained civilian into a war zone? The Americans made their bet and offered Raoul the chance to lead the rescue mission. Wallenberg accepted without hesitation, fully aware that he might never return home. But before packing his bags, he gave the Swedish Foreign Ministry an unprecedented ultimatum, one that openly violated every unwritten rule of international diplomacy. Raoul Wallenberg was no naive idealist. He understood perfectly well that ordinary diplomatic protest notes would achieve nothing in a Budapest gripped by panic. In the archives of the Swedish Foreign Ministry, there is still a remarkable document dated July 1944, an official order granting Wallenberg extraordinary emergency powers. As a condition of joining the mission, he demanded the right to use absolutely any means necessary to achieve the goal, including the secret bribery of officials, financial blackmail, and the direct bypassing of normal diplomatic hierarchy. What ambassador in his right mind would agree to such radical terms from an inexperienced civilian? But the situation had become so critical that Stockholm had no choice. Wallenberg was given the official status of first secretary of the Swedish diplomatic mission. His departure was prepared quickly and in a highly unusual way. From the recollections of his colleagues, we know exactly what he took with him on that dangerous assignment. His personal luggage consisted of only 2 modest travel backpacks, a warm sleeping bag, and a small revolver, which, notably, he never once drew from its holster during the entire mission. His real weapons were not bullets, but notebooks filled with useful contacts, a suitcase of money provided by the Americans, and an extraordinary understanding of the psychology of totalitarian bureaucracy. And that raises the central question: how did this desk negotiator expect to survive among patrols, curfews, and armed checkpoints? On July 9, 1944, his train slowly pulled into Budapest's central station. But what Raoul saw through the window onto the gray streets of the Hungarian capital made him realize at once that the old rules of diplomacy were already dead, and that the countdown of human lives was now measured in hours. Once in Budapest, the Swedish diplomat immediately began studying the old temporary passports that the embassy had occasionally issued to local residents for protection. He quickly saw their fatal weakness. They looked too cheap, too faded, too ordinary, more like simple certificates than serious documents. Armed inspectors on the streets would just tear them up without even glancing at the seals. Wallenberg made a brilliant psychological move. He designed an entirely new document that would become known to history as the Schutz-Pass, the protective passport. In surviving originals from the first major batch printed in August 1944, you can clearly see the bright yellow and blue colors of the Swedish flag. Wallenberg deliberately added elaborate watermarks, a whole cascade of official ministry stamps, and large sweeping signatures. The power of that thick piece of cardboard rested on one enormous bluff. In terms of international law, it had no real legal force and granted no citizenship. So why did patrols and military commanders stop when they saw it? Because visually it paralyzed German and Hungarian bureaucracy, a system trained to obey impressive-looking paper covered in seals and insignia. Archival correspondence between Hungarian ministries and the Swedish mission records an astonishing order officially recognizing 4,500 of these passports. It was the first major, tangible victory. The paper shield had begun to work on the streets of the city. But even as he saved people from immediate deportation, Raoul ran into a new problem that seemed impossible to solve. Where could he physically hide thousands of people carrying this cardboard passport when a nighttime patrol could raid their apartments at any moment? Even after getting hold of that precious life-saving paper, people still could not feel safe in their own homes. So Wallenberg made a decision that still astonishes historians with its audacity. Using funds provided by the Americans, he began secretly buying and leasing buildings all over Budapest. He took over abandoned city libraries, empty research institutes, and large apartment houses. He ordered his assistants to hang huge Swedish flags on the facades and mount respectable-looking signs reading things like Swedish Research Institute or Special Department of the Swedish Library. Using the authority of his mandate, he unilaterally declared these buildings extraterritorial territory of a neutral state. It was a bluff on a colossal scale, backed by no official treaty whatsoever. According to Budapest municipal records from the time, by the autumn of 1944, the number of these rented diplomatic buildings had reached 32. In the middle of a capital fully controlled by the enemy, Raoul created an entire ghost empire. Official records from the International Committee of the Red Cross contain an almost unimaginable figure. In buildings originally meant to house at best a few hundred residents, more than 15,000 people were squeezed in under brutal, overcrowded conditions. The obvious question is, how long could that illusion of safety last? Every day, thousands of people hid behind thin wooden doors marked only by the cardboard coat of arms of a foreign country. This incredibly fragile system of survival rested entirely on diplomatic status and Wallenberg's own aggressive personal charisma. It worked, and it saved lives until the middle of October, when an emergency radio announcement changed the rules of the game forever and shattered every remaining hope. On October 15, 1944, the situation in the Hungarian capital changed beyond repair, wiping out the earlier successes of the Swedish mission. According to surviving German military reports from that tense period, this was the day a swift and violent coup took place. Hungary's regent, Miklos Horthy, had tried to pull his exhausted country out of the war, fully aware that total military defeat was inevitable. But the enemy's intelligence network was alert, and Berlin responded immediately. A special commando unit carried out a bold operation to neutralize the Hungarian leadership and forced Horthy to capitulate. Power in the country was instantly seized by the radical Arrow Cross Party, led by Ferenc Szalasi. The streets of what had once been a relatively calm city now fell under the control of armed fanatics who had no interest whatsoever in international law or the diplomatic sensitivities of neutral states. In declassified Allied radio intercepts, the new leader's chilling address to the nation has been preserved. In his very first speech, Szalasi declared openly and categorically that none of the foreign protective documents issued earlier would be recognized. And here came the most terrifying question of all. How do you continue protecting tens of thousands of people hidden behind the thin walls of Swedish safe houses when the new regime has openly declared those papers invalid? The entire extraterritorial empire, built through such extraordinary effort, was suddenly under direct attack. Late that same grim evening, aggressive armed patrols wearing their distinctive armbands approached one of the shelters. Shouting as they came, they smashed through the heavy oak doors of the first Swedish safe house, forever destroying the fragile illusion of diplomatic immunity and launching a new phase of the tragedy. Realizing that traditional office diplomacy was completely dead, Raoul Wallenberg changed his strategy overnight. The cultured Swedish aristocrat was forced to become a hard-edged street fighter, willing to risk his own freedom to save others. He turned to aggressive intimidation, skillful bribery, and open blackmail of the local bureaucracy. Wallenberg began building an underground intelligence network, systematically drawing in Hungarian officials, senior police officers, and even ordinary members of the fascist party. He paid them with scarce food, huge amounts of cash, and, most importantly, firm promises of protection once Soviet troops inevitably entered the city. The scale of this illegal activity is staggering. Surviving payroll records from the Swedish mission show that by November, the staff of the so-called Section C, Wallenberg's special humanitarian department, had grown to 335 permanent employees. Most of these people worked deep underground, risking arrest by the security service at any moment. But how is it possible to keep hostile patrols loyal in the streets? The answer lies in the personal diaries of Raoul's colleagues, which document regular secret distributions of good food, expensive cigarettes, and even gold to the right city inspectors. This web of corruption, woven in the name of a higher purpose, made it possible to buy people out of prison cells and lift blockades around the safe houses. The diplomat bargained for every human life like a seasoned broker on the stock exchange. But no bribes, no persuasion, and no gold in the world could stop the monstrous plan that was being coldly approved at that very moment by the architect of the extermination campaign, who had decided that trains for mass deportations were no longer necessary. By late autumn, the country's transport infrastructure was close to collapse. Railway lines leading to the western border were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Unable to use freight trains, the enemy command issued an order unprecedented in its cruelty. People would be driven to the Austrian border on foot, through freezing wind and snow. The route stretched for roughly 200 kilometers. According to surviving guard orders, These death marches began on November 8th, 1944. Tens of thousands of exhausted people were forced onto frozen roads without warm clothing, proper food, or medical supplies. The scale of this forced evacuation is difficult for a modern person to grasp. According to the dry post-war estimates of international tribunals, around 70,000 people were sent along this route in just 1 month. What was a diplomat from a neutral country supposed to do when faced with such an endless column of the condemned? Wallenberg did not stay behind the safe walls of the embassy. He immediately organized a mobile convoy of cars and heavy trucks. The vehicles were loaded to the brim with warm blankets, field medical kits, food supplies, and huge stacks of blank Swedish protective passports. Raoul personally drove out onto the road to follow these grim processions. He caught up with one of the huge columns during a temporary halt in the middle of a snow-covered field. But officers guarding the line blocked his car and sharply ordered the foreigner to turn around at once and leave the restricted operation zone. Wallenberg threw open the car door and strode straight toward the armed convoy. In that moment, he staged an extraordinary performance, accusing the soldiers of unlawfully detaining people who were under the protection of the Swedish crown. He did not ask politely. He shouted at the officers, threatening them with post-war international tribunals for violating the Geneva Conventions. The psychological pressure was so intense that the heavily armed guards actually stepped back in confusion. Raoul opened the trunk of his car and began handing out blank protective passports in bundles, filling in the first names that came to mind as he went. He loudly ordered those who had received the precious papers to step out of the line of the doomed and climb into the waiting trucks. What kind of personal magnetism did it take to make enemy soldiers believe such a desperate bluff on a snowy roadside? According to testimony from surviving witnesses, including Thomas Lang, there was one astonishing case in which the diplomat pulled more than 100 people out of a column in a single operation simply by handing them colored pieces of cardboard. Fragments from the notebooks of Wallenberg's personal driver preserve a unique record of the blank forms issued on the grim road between Budapest and Heroism. These records confirm the vast scale of the diplomat's fieldwork. He was, in effect, playing God at the side of the road, deciding who would return to the city that day and who would continue the march. But how long could this reckless game of nerves with the escort officers go on? In the end, the convoy backed off and allowed the trucks to return to the capital. Yet Wallenberg knew perfectly well that the main sorting point lay farther ahead, right at the border, where heavy freight trains were leaving every hour. Wallenberg's car sped onto the grounds of the border station at Heroism. Before him was a terrifying sight. A massive train stood ready to depart toward the sites of mass confinement. At that moment, the Swedish diplomat carried out an act that would enter history as a symbol of absolute fearlessness. Ignoring the guards' furious shouts, Raoul climbed onto the roof of a freight car and began running across the train, throwing protective passports by the handful through narrow vents and half-open doors. The station guards were enraged. In the memoirs of Swedish diplomat Per Anger, there are clear reports that in November and December 1944, patrols at this station repeatedly fired warning shots from submachine guns over Wallenberg's head. But the Swede did not even duck. He kept working under a hail of bullets, betting that the soldiers would not dare openly kill an accredited diplomat from a neutral country. How could anyone stay so calm while balancing on an icy train roof under gunfire? According to railway dispatchers from the time, these transports often consisted of 50 or 60 cars at once, packed to capacity with exhausted people. Wallenberg shouted to the prisoners inside to grab the passports and demand that the station chief remove them from the train immediately. Dozens of hands reached through the cracks toward those yellow and blue sheets of salvation. After tearing several hundred more lives from the departing train, the exhausted diplomat returned to Budapest. But when he reached his secret apartment, he found an urgent note waiting on the table. The enemy security service had placed him under round-the-clock surveillance, and the ring around him was tightening fast. Realizing that secret maneuvers in the streets no longer worked, Wallenberg decided on an unprecedented step. He would meet his chief enemy face to face. He arranged a secret dinner with Adolf Eichmann himself, the man whose signature stood beneath orders for the systematic destruction of hundreds of thousands of lives. The meeting in one of Budapest's half-empty restaurants resembled a tense game of chess played at the very edge of an abyss. The Swedish diplomat tried to understand the twisted logic of his opponent and, using all his powers of persuasion, convince him that the war was already lost and the machinery of extermination had to stop at once. Testimony from Raoul's colleagues and post-war interrogation records of high-ranking officers document this extraordinary dinner, which took place in the autumn of 1944. The conversation quickly hardened into an icy exchange of veiled threats. Eichmann, barely hiding his irritation, made it politely but very clearly known that the status of a foreign diplomat did not guarantee absolute safety. That leads to a chilling question. In that moment, did Wallenberg understand that he was looking straight into the eyes of a man who had already passed sentence on him? Declassified dispatches from the Reich Main Security Office preserve Eichmann's official complaint to Berlin about the outrageous behavior of this insolent Swede who dared interfere openly in state operations. The enemy no longer intended to tolerate Wallenberg's presence in the city. The words spoken over that dinner table quickly turned into action. Just a few days later, a heavy military truck, as if by pure accident, barreled into an intersection and smashed headlong into Wallenberg's diplomatic car, reducing it to wreckage. After the staged crash, all illusions vanished. Wallenberg understood that his diplomatic immunity no longer meant anything, and assassination attempts became a grim daily reality. Raoul decided to disappear underground, leaving for good the official residence of the Swedish mission that was now well known to the enemy. A draining cat-and-mouse game with the secret police began. Reports secretly smuggled to Stockholm said that contact with the outside world had almost entirely broken down and that the few coded telegrams that did get through arrived fatally late. The diplomat had to sleep in a different place almost every night, moving between damp basements, abandoned warehouses, and secret apartments. The records kept by his personal aides show that in December 1944 alone, he used at least 10 separate safe houses. And that raises the key question: how do you manage a vast underground rescue network when you yourself have become a hunted target pursued day and night? The danger came not only from street patrols. Declassified Allied intelligence archives contain an intercepted radio message from senior enemy officials recommending that the bothersome Swedish interference be neutralized immediately by any available means. Raoul's life hung by a thread. He moved through the city in short dashes, often changing cars and coats to avoid notice. The situation worsened by the hour, but soon the center of danger shifted. In early December, heavy Soviet artillery shells began bursting in the suburbs of Budapest. Soviet forces were closing in relentlessly on the Hungarian capital, turning the city into one vast, inescapable trap. Operational reports from the Soviet High Command record that on December 26, 1944, Budapest was completely encircled, cutting off every route of retreat. But did that mean salvation for the tens of thousands hiding behind the fragile doors of the extraterritorial houses? Or did it only speed up the final tragedy? Absolute chaos took over the streets. Drinking water stopped flowing, electricity vanished, and food supplies ran out within days. Brutal street fighting began, with every city block turning into a fortress. Enemy records from the period confirmed that the armed militants of the Arrow Cross fully understood that defeat was inevitable. Realizing their power had only hours left, they turned to open, unrestrained terror, determined to take as many innocent lives with them as possible. The weather became their silent ally. According to surviving meteorological records, temperatures that winter plunged to minus 15 degrees Celsius. The cold seeped into unheated basements, draining the last strength from exhausted and terrified people waiting in darkness for whatever would come next. Fanatic patrols no longer bothered checking papers or following lengthy bureaucratic procedures. One such freezing, ominous night, a group of armed men stormed the central Swedish house, ignored the diplomatic seals, and at gunpoint dragged dozens of defenseless people away toward the black, ice-bound waters of the river. From yet another hideout, Wallenberg began hearing terrifying rumors about what was happening at night along the city embankments. The militants were using a method so brutal it still chills the soul. They brought people to the edge of the frozen parapet, tied them together in groups of 3 with barbed wire, and shot only one of them. As the victim fell into the dark water, the others were dragged down as well. It was done with horrifying pragmatism simply to save ammunition during the siege. According to historical investigations and the precise figures of post-war memorials, the number of innocent victims on that embankment ran into the thousands. What kind of inhuman resolve did it take for a diplomat to step voluntarily into that darkness, right into the center of madness, and try to bargain with men carrying out such killings? Raoul and his most loyal associates rushed to the scene again and again. In later recollections by the rescued Zuza Robbie and in official reports of the Swedish mission from January 1945, there are detailed accounts of Wallenberg's team literally pulling half-frozen people out of the icy water while risking their own lives every second. The diplomat threatened the killers with inevitable retribution from the advancing Red Army, offered them gold, jewels, and guarantees of protection in exchange for canceling their orders. This desperate bargaining on the edge of the abyss brought partial success, and dozens of lives were miraculously snatched away from death. But the worst test was still ahead. That same icy night, the diplomat heard of a secret order that would wipe the central ghetto off the face of the earth, along with all the tens of thousands trapped inside it, before Soviet troops entered the city. Knowing the city was doomed to fall, the enemy command prepared its final and most monstrous act. The plan was brutally simple: destroy the central ghetto and all its inhabitants before the first Soviet units could reach the district. In testimony given years later at a post-war trial, Wallenberg's associate Paul Salai confirmed that the liquidation was scheduled for January 12th and 13th, 1945. The moment he learned this, Raoul Wallenberg sent Salai to the commander of the German garrison in Budapest, General Gerhard Schmidhuber, with an extraordinary ultimatum. Through his envoy, the Swedish diplomat delivered a direct message. If the massacre took place, Wallenberg would personally make sure that Schmidhuber was brought before a tribunal and sentenced as a war criminal. The natural question is, how could a man with no army threaten a general commanding an entire garrison? That astonishing bluff, grounded in Wallenberg's total confidence, worked perfectly. The general, fully aware that the war was nearing its end, canceled the assault at the last possible moment. Survivor counts conducted immediately after the fighting show that because of that single decision, an extraordinary 70,000 lives were saved. The order canceling the attack on the ghetto was issued just hours before the operation was due to begin. And the next morning, the first Soviet patrols appeared in the snow-covered streets of the shattered city, signaling the end of the occupation. Street fighting was rapidly moving toward the very center of the Hungarian capital. Raoul Wallenberg made a measured decision. His main mission of protecting people was over, and now he needed to think about rebuilding the ruined metropolis and returning property to the survivors. He came out of hiding, expecting the new forces to treat him as an ally and as an official representative of a neutral state. Declassified combat journals from the 151st Rifle Division record the Swedish diplomat's first contact with an advanced Soviet patrol on January 13th, 1945. Raoul was calm and confident. According to eyewitnesses, he carried a heavy 15-kilogram backpack. It held not personal belongings, but detailed plans for post-war reconstruction, financial estimates, and large amounts of cash supplied by the American government for relief work. And that raises an uneasy question. How were field commanders hardened by a brutal war supposed to react to an elegant foreigner carrying suitcases of currency and maintaining a complex underground network behind enemy lines? The officers received him very politely, listened to his requests, and then firmly asked him to go with them to headquarters in Debrecen for an official meeting with Marshal Malinovsky, commander of the front. Raoul Wallenberg and his loyal driver Vilmos Langfelder got into their car under armed Soviet escort. On the way, they made a short stop at the Swedish mission to collect a few things and say goodbye to exhausted colleagues. It was there that Raoul spoke the famous prophetic line later recorded in the mission diaries. He said that he was going to see the commander of the front, but had no idea whether he was going as an honored guest or as a prisoner. Soviet military counterintelligence had already begun its invisible work. Investigators were deeply suspicious of this man. Why did a Swedish citizen possess such large amounts of American dollars? Why had he maintained direct contacts with the enemy's highest authorities? And why had he built such a vast underground network in an occupied city? In declassified security archives, researchers found a top-secret document, a direct order from the Deputy Defense Commissar to arrest the Swedish diplomat. That leads to a chilling question. At what point on that journey did the status of foreign representative quietly turn into the status of detainee? January 17, 1945 became the date of Raoul Wallenberg's last confirmed appearance in ruined Budapest. His car, accompanied by a military patrol, slowly left the city and headed east. But the vehicle never reached the front commander's headquarters, and the trail of one of that era's greatest heroes vanished forever into the frozen air of wartime Hungary. The road out of ruined Budapest did not lead Raoul Wallenberg to the headquarters of the front commander. It led instead to the dark corridors of the internal prison at Lubyanka in Moscow. But how long could anyone endure such crushing psychological and physical pressure without the slightest hope of help from outside? In mid-July 1947, Raoul suddenly stopped answering the agreed taps on the wall. And in a closed medical journal at the prison, a strange entry appeared that changed the course of this historical mystery forever. The mystery of how the life of this great righteous man actually ended is still shrouded in darkness. For decades, Raoul's relatives knocked on the doors of one high office after another, trying to learn even a fragment of the truth about his fate. In declassified materials officially handed to the Swedish side only in 1957, there appears the so-called report of Colonel Smoltsov of the medical service. This short document claims that on July 17, 1947, prisoner Wallenberg died suddenly in his solitary cell of a heart attack. And here comes the most painful question of all. Why would an apparently healthy 34-year-old man who had survived the unimaginable hell of besieged Budapest suddenly die inside a tightly guarded prison? Most independent researchers still doubt the credibility of that report, assuming that the Swedish diplomat was sentenced to death as an inconvenient witness to large political games. His personal story seemed to dissolve into the dark archives of the security services, leaving behind neither a confirmed burial place nor final letters home. Yet his true legacy proved stronger than prison walls and stronger than secret orders to erase the evidence. According to the official archives of Yad Vashem, in 1963, Raoul Wallenberg was posthumously honored as righteous among the nations for his unmatched courage. A man with no army, no heavy weapons, and no conventional power, using only paper, stamps, and extraordinary bravery, saved more lives than many generals took on the battlefield. Today, the living proof of his existence and of his triumph over pure evil can be seen in the tens of thousands of descendants of those doomed people who survived the center of that tragedy because of a single yellow and blue sheet of cardboard.